I know we had very short Q&A sessions, and so the floor is open for comments. Laurel.
Okay, this will be a sort of a question disguised as a comment because I want reaction. Thinking about where you have all brought us, maybe relative to where we were 25 years ago when we celebrated the centenary of the Jessup North Pacific Expedition. And, thinking of Barbara's point, a lot of water's been added. And that means a lot of goodwill and hard work and ongoing process on the part of all of you. But the second thing, this recombining, there's a technology element that really wasn't mentioned. What the internet enables in terms of the bringing together of dispersed collections and dispersed knowledge. And I'm wondering if any of you want to respond to that.
Well, I'll just jump in right there because I've been working on this. This is so bizarre. I've been working on this for decades, and I've been interested in all these media. And when I started working, it was purely, it was photographs on paper, all that stuff. And I had some of these perceptions of how this material was related, and I couldn't put it together, and I couldn't share it with anybody. And now we clearly can do that, and it's clearly a technological. It's an enabler of things that were theoretical decades ago, and now are practical. And so I'm totally thrilled with it, and I'm sure we can do it. And of course, the other thing that Aaron hasn't really explored here is we're taught our most immediate project is going to be a critical edition as a printed book, but the thing behind that is going to be a digital online, some kind of online edition, which is going to blow all this to in many directions, and that's what's really exciting. So yeah, we're going.
I'd just like to add, from the community's perspective, the ability to access the information is critical for our people, and I feel a little privileged because I have colleagues and friends here at this table that provide me with information, and I'm looking forward to the time when other people in our community will have free and open access to this same information, and the availability of it will be changed forever. And because so much of this information, the corrections and other notes and things are locked away in Philadelphia, some of it not even fully explored. And whenever our people get a chance to come out and explore those collections, they come away with a lot of information, and that information finds its way into our ceremonies. And so this is a start in kind of making this more accessible to our people.
I would just add a couple points. In the exhibition, we have a touch screen where you can experience the prototype that we've built for the digital edition, so you can see what our ultimate ambitions are in terms of synthesizing the kind of vast amounts of material that we have here, and our technological partner in the project is here with us today, and we're so we have that in view, but we're a couple years away from realizing that level of things. The other technological component, which I don't want to go into in great detail here, which we've published about a bit recently in an essay in the journal Museum Worlds, is that one of the big challenges for the project behind the scenes technologically is to create a database and a metadata structure that is sensitive to the kinds of genealogical connections that we've that the notes reveal. And so there's been a kind of, I don't know that it was unexpected exactly, but a vast part of the kind of backstage of this project has been to figure out how to make technology work for the conceptual and intellectual work of the project, and that's a whole other conference. but that's been one of the exciting and difficult and challenging aspects of the project, to realize the ambitions of the digital technology to disseminate the material. We also need to make the digital technology harness and contain the material in a way that's very complicated, as you can imagine after
Just the most basic issue, one of the most basic issues we encountered was that we had to be able to both represent, say, a mask as an object in a repository and as a cultural item that was connected to other cultural items and had a genealogical context. So in our database, every mask has two incarnations, kind of, as different kinds of, and the same for all the other media.
Katie?
It was brought up today, the sort of famous quote about Boaz searching for the culture as it appeared to the Indian himself, or maybe I don't have the words quite right, but and then you mentioned Hunt's role being very invisible in anthropology for so many decades, and Kareem sort of starting to unwrap that, and then now we've sort of swung quite a long way to new scholarship that is suggesting that Hunt fully shaped Boaz's philosophies and in some ways. And I'm wondering, as you start to uncover not only Hunt's much greater role in all of the authoring of these things, but also the informants that people that Hunt was working with, I'm just wondering sort of where you sit now in terms of Hunt's shaping of the larger project and of the way that Boaz, conceptualized presenting anthropology in this much more holistic manner.
I think that Boaz brought with him from Germany really key parts of his later theoretical development that owe their roots to the German liberal intellectual tradition. And Hunt was very important in his career, and one of the ways in which Hunt was important, I think, was this realization that Hunt could do so much of a better job of recording, partly because he was there, but partly because he understood what mattered. And as Ira has said, Boaz is full of contradictions, and that's what makes him interesting. It can also be what makes him very frustrating. There are things that are hard to reconcile now, and one of them is the way in which he seemed to initially very generously acknowledge Hunt, and he became less generous as he became more status conscious of the importance of professionalization in anthropology, and Hunt, of course, had very little, if any, formal education. So, in terms of the development of Boaz's theory, I disagree with a lot of what some of the people, certain people have said, which ignores the well-documented relationship of Boaz to that whole tradition that he came out of in Germany. But I absolutely support the centrality of Hunt in Boaz's ethnographic project and many other aspects of his research. So.
Actually, I have a question. I think it's pretty clear what an important role Hunt played in Boaz's work, but I'm curious, do we have any insight at all into the impact that Boaz had on Hunt?
Yes. Although, in terms of the income they derived from it,
And
is one thing that allowed him to have a rather different life than he might have otherwise. I mean, he always worked at other things.
But like say travel, recognition, the World's Fair. In other words, like, what would Hunt have been a different person had he not met Boaz?
Yes, absolutely.
How so?
I've talked to Judith about this. Yes and no. So the interesting thing is that before Hunt ever met Boaz, before they met each other, Hunt was already the person that he later became. He was of mixed parentage. His lifelong trajectory, personality was to be a cultural mediator. And he was already working as a translator. He was working as a merchant. He was shipping materials. He was guiding anthropologists. So everything he later did, he was doing from childhood.
He went to work for the Hudson's Bay Company when he was 11 years old.
And of course, his mother was Tlingit. He wasn't a Kwakiutl, but then he married two Kwakiutl women. Then he meets Boaz, and he sort of, of course, Boaz never paid him enough so that he could only do ethnography.
There were periods.
Yes, exactly.
When he was paid enough.
There were periods, but he always had to go back and forth. So he spends most of his life after that doing ethnography and working as an ethnographic assistant. And when you read the letters, they're very, I mean, we can talk more about the nuances, but they're clearly very close, and they're working on the same project, and Hunt appreciates that. This is what Hunt wants to do, and he knows that Boaz is allowing him to do it. So Boaz is allowing him, and he pays him, so he's allowing him to continue what he started to do as a young man. But if they had never met, Hunt would probably still have been on that road, and Boaz let him do more of it.
So I think the big difference is probably that Hunt would not have become a writer in the same way.
Yes.
He would have used writing as documentation, but he would not have authored, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 pages. So Boaz encouraged, maybe we can even say he pushed him to write.
Mentored?
He mentored him, but he definitely wanted Hunt to be a writer as well as a collector, and pushed him to write more and more. And Hunt became much more fluent as a writer as he went on. He became much more at ease. And in the 20s, he was writing, in the teens, he was writing hundreds and hundreds of pages per year. So.
What were the age differences between them?
Hunt was born in 1854, and Boaz was born in 1857.
Yeah. Within a few years. The question in the back? Peter?
Yeah, thank you very much. All really wonderful. But thinking about the Boaz-Hunt relationship, it was thinking in terms of the history of scholarship, right? The study of other peoples was often mediated through native informants. So I wrote a book a few years ago about a scholar in the 17th century who hung out with a bunch of merchants and visitors from other places. And what came out was that the picture of scholars as in an ivory tower doing contemplative things actually wasn't true. They were much more knowledgeable about the world of activity and commerce because those were the people they hung out with. So I'm wondering, I'm assuming that Boaz-Hunt could be replicated in many other anthropological projects. And so the question would be, what would the self-image of anthropology's history look like if the sort of dark star in orbit with the famous anthropologists were put in the center? How would the history of anthropology look differently?
Use the center.
Well, I think since the 1980s, since the sort of crisis in anthropology, there's been a lot of critical reflection on the role of sources of information, informants, and certain key individuals emerged in narratives for individual anthropologists or people who worked with multiple anthropologists. So I think the discipline has been doing some of that work already. Of course, part of the kind of theoretical discussion at that moment in sort of critical reflexivity in anthropology was about the kind of dialogical nature of ethnographic knowledge production, that it's based on talking to people, and that even when a lot of the sources go unnamed, they're there, and then there's been a lot of work to kind of critically recuperate them as individuals like Hunt. And Judith can speak. She's worked on projects on other kind of key Indigenous ethnographers. And
the Northwest Coast is notable, but I was recently looking at Paul Radin's Theory, Method, and Ethnology, published in the 30s, where he says there are two countervailing trends in Boasian anthropology in the first half of the 20th century. And one is the professionalization of anthropology and wanting to take anthropology out of the hands of uninformed amateurs. And Boaz came out of this German scientific rigor, we want people to be educated and know what they're doing. The other trend, and Paul Reagan talks in there about how he judged it was an American anthropological methodological principle, he said, to make ethnographers out of your informants. And he makes a list of all the ones who had done it. But what's interesting in that passage is he doesn't name them. And other anthropologists did name them, obviously, but because of this, I believe, because of this professionalization and this need to kind of promote university-trained anthropologists in the face of these other people out there. And a lot of it, as Barbara mentioned, there was this very dark vein of eugenics, racism, anti-immigration stuff going on, in which the Boasians believed that they were in a battle against the dark forces, and they won that battle institutionally. But a side effect of it was to kind of denigrate the people that they were working with, not necessarily intentionally, but they weren't professionals, so,
Can I ask?
I was going to ask a question. So, Hun, my great-grandfather, he was English and he was Tlingit, and he wasn't Kwakiutl. So, was he learning these things as he was studying? I mean, so he's not embedded in a way that where, he's a native. He's actually on the outside coming in.
he's next door.
He's next door.
Which was palisaded when he was a boy, but the palisade, I don't know when the palisade disappeared. So he was not Kwakiutl, but he knew all these people, and he was in and out of their houses, and
Word grew into that.
he spoke it fluently. Like there's some questions about like some aspects of how he wrote Kwakiutl, but he was certainly very fluent and he understood it, and these people. My son, who's first year in college now, made a comment as he was cleaning up the house. He said, when you go into other people's houses and you see the mess, it just looks like mess because you don't know why those things are there. When it's your own house, everything has a story. You know why you haven't put that away. And when I look at that picture of Nwiti that's been published so many times, I think for Hunt, nothing in there was unknown. Everything in there had a story because he lived in the community. He knew everyone who lived in every house. And so whatever he was, not Kwakiutl, but he knew all those people.
Yeah,
They were all people. They were all individuals with stories.
The other way around, though, I've thought about this, and I think Kareem is exactly right. There were other Kwakiutl that tried to do the same kind of thing, but they didn't do it the same way Hunt did. And I'm convinced the reason Hunt did it that way is because he wasn't a native, quote unquote. His father was English and his mother was Tlingit, but he grew up in a Kwakiutl community. So I think he always had a distance to the Kwakiutl, and he could objectify them and think about them and think about how he knew what he knew and how about learning it. And I'm convinced that was at the core of who he became.
He didn't say my people. He said those Kwakiutl.
That's right. Yeah.
But he would have spoken English as a first language.
No, I don't think he did. Well,
Which language would he have
Well, I think it was kind of bilingual. Well, you know a bit more about this.
Well, Wayne Suttles
was
was
my
the dean
grandfather?
of Northwest Coast anthropologists who told me that many mixed marriages, what they spoke in the household and what their children grew up, was Chinook jargon. And certainly he was completely fluent in Chinook jargon. I think that he spoke Tlingit with his mother, and he probably spoke English with his father, but I think in the home, like what did Anasalaga and Robert Hunt speak? They probably spoke Chinook jargon. And it became creolized, it became a much more of a full-fledged language in those families.
We were talking about some paradoxes in Boaz and inconsistencies, and for me this speaks to one of them, which is that Boaz very early on develops this sort of theoretical approach to anthropology, and more specifically to culture, as in constant dynamic flux and in change, and he's interested in diffusion as a mechanism of cultural change. And people often talk about Boaz's sort of selective vision in museum collections, that he didn't want obvious objects that had colonial materials or motifs that he wanted to kind of salvage or showcase a kind of pre-colonial indigenous authenticity. His collections are filled with traces of that, but he sort of saw past them. When those objects that show a kind of dynamic incorporation of outside materials and motifs and ideas would have perfectly illustrated his theory of cultural dynamism and diffusion. He just chose to only illustrate that theory with inter-indigenous diffusion and not intercultural colonial diffusion. And his treatment of Hunt is, for me, parallel to that. Hunt could have been a perfect example of Boaz's theoretical point that culture and cultural identity change, that Hunt was not by birth Kwakiutl, and yet his children were, and they became incorporated into these Kwakiutl communities over generations through practices of knowledge transmission. That is Boaz's theoretical definition of culture, but instead of making Hunt exemplary of that, he brackets Hunt's bicultural identity to maintain the kind of ethnographic authority of his text in the way that Judith was just talking about. And it's just one of those times you just want to go back in time and shake Boaz and say you're doing yourself a disservice because you're limiting the range of when the material's right there.
I think it in part comes from his German intellectual antecedents and the one language, one culture background that he came from. Even though it was right in front of him, he had trouble kind of mentally parsing the idea that you could have these very multicultural, intercultural kinds of events and senses of identity and people. So George Hunt, he sort of couldn't mentally cope with George Hunt as his whole person yet.
Kareem, did you want to say something?
Question?
I think Kareem has
just
something to say.
one other thing is that when he's collecting these things, it's after a time when technology had changed. So if he was really collecting things, before the colonizers came, they would not look at anything like the pieces that were collected.
And I wanted to add two things. One, as to why anthropologists didn't give the same status to the people that were actually a major source of the information. First of all, I think there's a big shift in anthropology as a museum field to being a university field. And with that shift, given the focus on collecting on the World's Fairs and museum anthropology, etc., with that shift, there also was a shift towards, first of all, theory, methodology, and the non-material aspects of culture. And so social systems, beliefs, whatever, but it was a kind of a paradigmatic shift. And with that paradigmatic shift, although ethnography continues to be important, in a sense, it really becomes the anthropologist's terrain, and it's part of the professionalization of the field and that kind of thing. So that was one point. The second is that diffusion and contact aren't the same thing.
Say that again?
Diffusion and contact aren't the same thing. Because in the theories of diffusion, you don't necessarily have massive events of, two people, one very powerful, having an enormous impact and rapid change. That's not diffusion. So I think that may be an element in Boaz's not. And plus, it's salvage ethnography in a moment where you have to establish priorities. You can't collect everything, so you've got to ask yourself, in this particular moment, what's the priority? And obviously, the priority was what was perceived to be at the 11th hour about to disappear.
Okay. I have to speak up now because how many of you people have been to the Museum of American History lately?
Natural history or history?
Which one?
Right up the street here. Museum of American Museum of Natural History.
Surface.
How many people have been to the Hall of the Northwest Coast Indian Tribes? Okay. How recent have you been there, sir?
6 months ago.
Okay. The hall
Give
is
or
closed.
take a couple of months.
The hall is closed. And why is it closed? It's closed because what they're doing is they're inviting members of the different tribes that are represented in the museum to come to the museum and talk about the objects that were on exhibition, because nothing is on exhibition now, and they're changing the museum over. Just what we're talking about, okay? Things that maybe years ago, clay pots were important, but maybe they're not important now. And we've already started doing it, and we're saying to these representatives of the tribes, you tell us objects that are spiritual to your tribe, that are very important to your tribe. And what's happening is they're going back to the tribe. Okay? So we can't give everything back to the tribes because then there's no museum. Then we'll have to have a paper museum or things like that. So it's changing, and you brought that up about the ones in Germany. I think you mentioned in your talk about the objects that were picked. Okay, I don't really remember it, but I just wanted to bring that up to you guys because you're all involved in museums and other cultural institutions. I haven't seen your exhibit yet.
Oh, you're not here.
Okay, that's a good inspiration, right?
Absolutely.
So I think we're on the right track.
Okay, thank you.
Museum of Natural History.
Thank you.
And
Okay, thank
So
you very much.
certainly this project is happening in an environment of
Absolutely.
massive rethinking of ethnographic museums and museological display. We have a couple more questions. Chris?
Yeah, thank you all for your papers today and for your words and knowledge. I have a question about the legacy of the Hunt Boaz texts and particularly the mediation of the illustrations and images that several of the papers touched upon, and what the panel, I'm especially looking at Ira and Aaron, and what the panel thinks of this extra layer of mediation to the illustrations that were then repeatedly used by artists in the second half of the 20th century, and what your new research has to say about how some of those images in texts that were really viewed as Bibles of form, knowing how they were mediated differently now, how you think that affects the legacy of the work created in the period formerly known as the Renaissance.
You mean by Indigenous artists?
Yes, by Indigenous artists, but also if our own side, hobby carvers, I'd be happy to hear about that.
Or maybe we could hear from the artists.
Yeah.
Yeah, or Andy.
Sure. Andy.
I mean, let me try to parse your question. Would it be safe to say that the question is really now that we have a better kind of historiographical grasp on the way the book was produced and the way in which it circulated, does that change the way we think about its history of influence on artists, Indigenous and not, and how does the kind of use of the book, more in the generation before Andy was talking about, or generations before, how do we rethink their dipping into the book for inspiration, let's say?
Especially formally.
Especially formally, in terms of formal inspiration, for the historical materials. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
As I touched on earlier, the technology has changed so much that what they would have seen in the beginning looks nothing like what they saw. When they were able to use steel knives instead of stone. So there's a sort of a rapid change in the art and what it looked like from time of contact to that short period, and that continues today. So as the technology changes, we continue to use different technology and broaden the use of the art in ceremony as well as in decorative arts. So, and I myself don't do art that is used in potages. So mine is a field that's out there outside of all of that. And my inspiration comes from places like the book, but it's also trying to have a sense of what that essence of that art is, and where it comes through George and my grandfather through to me. So it's really important to understand that sort of historical timeline.
Andy?
I just think about one thing that my grandmother used to say, because she used to have collectors come by and buy up all of her old stuff. Unfortunately, but she said that the objects themselves aren't that important. It's the rights to have them that's important.
Sure.
The rights to recreate those objects. Sure. And so those objects have been created and recreated countless times over the generations, as generations pass on and these objects deteriorate, or they'll be replaced by new ones, and they'll be represented in different ways as art forms and styles change over time. And so what a Walasacha headdress or a Nutlamata looks like now might not look the same as it did 100 years ago, but the essence is there, and the way that we use it, and the showing of our ceremonial prerogatives is the more important element of it, not the physical object.
That's cool. Culture today.
Before you go, I would like to answer the question in a different way. You were most interested in Native artists, so you've just heard from two of them. I've actually studied this question for non-Native artists and for Anglos during the 20th century. And the major conclusion I came to is that the Anglo artists like Barnard Newman or Wolfgang Paulin or Morris Graves or whatever actually only cared about the appearance of objects. They never read the books. They didn't care what Boaz and Hunt said about these objects. And so if we now had transparency and they learned about what these things were based on, it wouldn't make any difference to them. They would just do it the way they wanted to do it the way it appealed to them, and go on with it. So.
Yeah, there's some moves now. There's an organization called Local Contexts. This goes back to the digital technology question, which is working on creating a set of traditional knowledge licenses or labels that circulate in a digital environment, which Indigenous people can choose to attach to digitally circulating representations of their cultural heritage. This is a way to say we can't stop the digital circulation of images of our cultural heritage. We don't have rights under Western intellectual property law, but if repositories agree to let us stamp, watermark digital circulating cultural heritage with some aspects of protocol around how they work internally, that it creates a kind of ethical environment for the a more responsible use of those. Will it ever stop people from just ripping them off? No. But as a consciousness raising effort, it's a way of showcasing the contemporaneity and sovereignty of Indigenous people to assert a kind of sense of proprietary claim and to impose a kind of ethical standard.
And you could do it in signage also.
Yeah, absolutely. You could do it in museum context. It doesn't have to be a digital context. And in a way, I think our project may serve a similar kind of function. People will, it will remediate these remediations, as Barbara said. It's turtles all the way down. But, and in a way, it will increase the ability for people to rip this stuff off, because now instead of just black and white drawings of hundreds of objects, they'll have color photos of hundreds of objects. So it will facilitate that work, but by re-embedding it in the environment of cultural knowledge and practice that Andy and Kareem were just talking about, it also, we think frames the material in a way that it hasn't been, hopefully. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut off formal Q&A right now, but we're going to open the doors, and there's a reception waiting for us outside, and I hope you stay and mingle and continue to ask questions, and thank you all for joining us, and enjoy. Thank you.